Hello and welcome to Comic Island. You know, we do a lot of videos on fun topics here at Comic Island. This isn't one of them. The 15-year anniversary of the world's largest terrorist attack in modern history is as good a time to talk about this as any, I suppose, but I was reluctant to even bother, really, which is why this video is coming in about a week late. Though that being said, out of respect, it probably was best to give a little time from the actual anniversary before putting this up. So why dredge up the past at all? The vast majority of people watching this video already lived through this terrible event, and in some way, however small, each and every one of us has paid some price due to either this attack or the many consequences of it, which are still felt today. Some feel these effects more than others, definitely, but you can't be part of civilization without 9/11 somehow affecting you, because its effects bled into each and every aspect of our lives. This is weighty stuff for a little comic book channel that's normally largely concerned with what outfit Batman wants to wear today. I was thinking about making this video on the actual anniversary when I ultimately decided against it and had originally dropped this idea entirely. But then somebody out of the blue, without any provocation on my part, requested I do it on Twitter. And we get a lot of requests, all of which I record in the hope of doing someday, but when a video I already had an inkling to make gets requested, I do tend to opt for those right away. When there's something I, on some level, already wanted to talk about that other people also want to hear, that's a good combination and usually a pretty worthwhile project. So here we are, 9/11. I'm gonna say this right now, this is not a video about the event exactly, or about the political ramifications of the event, although both of these things will be very relevant. But rather, this is a video about the effects of the attack on the public psyche in general, and how 9/11 was depicted in media, particularly comics. So whatever political nonsense or conspiracy theories you may have, please don't share it here. Nobody wants to hear it. That's not what this video is about or for. Please just take your opinions elsewhere, because that's really not what we're here for. Thank you, even though I know half of you will ignore this. This is going to be a tough video, both for me to grapple with the topic, but also for you to be able to sit through without feeling really depressed. I'm going to make it interesting, I'm going to try and keep it somewhat lighthearted, but I have no intention of making light of all of this. After all, 9/11 is the 9/11 of geopolitical events that reshaped modern society and it left a ton of people dead. We're going to be talking about a very serious, very real event and its effects on one particular aspect of popular culture. And there's no denying it, 9/11 had a major sustained impact on every aspect of our media. Movies featuring New York City had to be heavily edited while there was some serious change in tone and themes being explored. The imagery of 9/11 has led to a complex relationship with the public which is still felt in today's movies, as we've seen in the reaction to Man of Steel and the reaction to that reaction in the actual plot of Batman v Superman. Television also got darker and far more willing, for better or worse, to feature scenes of torture, terrorism, and violence. Though, interestingly, modern comic book TV shows seem to be taking steps away from that towards more traditional ideals of superheroes pre-Bronze Age, or at the very least, stuff that isn't so overly focused on terrorism, but other fun issues like gentrification, organized crime, or rape. And yet, there's more to it than that. I still don't think anyone fully understands the effects this thing had on public psyche. Ostensibly, it's strange that it's such a big event. As many people have correctly pointed out throughout the last 15 years, way worse things happened before or after this event with far greater loss of life. Now, 9/11 resulted in the deaths of almost 3,000 people. Devastating, yes, but a drop in the bucket compared to, say, the 138,000 who died 10 years before during a cyclone in Bangladesh, or the 280,000 people who died only 3 years after 9/11 after a massive earthquake in the Indian Ocean triggered deadly tsunami. Or, even worse, when we consider the 40 million people minimum that died during World War II, or even the amount of people that died in Iraq in the years following 9/11, in comparison, this single terrorist attack doesn't seem so bad, at least going by these cold numbers. For a long, unhappily long time, I had a lot of trouble getting past this point. It took me a long time to fully respect how 9/11 was unique compared to these events, because it's hard to understand that. It was hard to reconcile all the grandstanding speeches and memorials for this one day against the size, scale, and depth of human life that is lost on a regular basis. I was a kid when the towers fell. I remember everybody watching the news in stony silence, and I just tried to run away from the whole thing as best I could. Nobody that young wants to deal with something that serious, and it was easier to just dismiss 9/11 as small beans compared to war, famine, and disease. So I did what I have done too often and just shut out the world. I kept my head down, was openly annoyed about how everyone was just constantly glued to watching CNN, and just focused on school, video games, anything to escape the fermenting reality around me. About a month or so after the attacks, that all changed. The Daily Show came back on, and it was Jon Stewart's words that really got me to first react to this whole thing. It's a pretty long speech that he had coming back after 9/11, and YouTube's content policies are especially insane lately. So here's a brief quote that I'll go through, the part that really got to me and the part that means the most to me. You can check out the full clip online. And no, I'm not doing a Jon Stewart voice. You know, all this talk about these guys are criminals, they got together and their extraordinary guile and their wit and their skill, it's all a lie. Any fool can blow something up. Any fool can destroy. But to see these guys, these firemen and policemen and these people from all over the country, literally with buckets, rebuilding, that's extraordinary. And that's why we have already won. They can't. It's light. It's democracy. They can't shut that down. They live in chaos. And chaos, it can't sustain itself. It never could. It's too easy and it's too unsatisfying. The view from my apartment, Jon Stewart chokes up for a moment, was the World Trade Center. Now it's gone. They attacked it. This symbol of American ingenuity and strength, and labor and imagination and commerce, and it's gone. But you know what the view is now? The Statue of Liberty. The view from the south of Manhattan is the Statue of Liberty. You can't beat that. I'm not ashamed to say this broke me. I cried a lot alone in my room when I saw this. I wept. I let it all out. All the grief that had been storing up in little 11-year-old me, all the pain and suffering I'd seen over the last month, all the fear at seeing the adults in my life I looked up to for guidance as fearless parents and wise teachers turning hollow and broken. 9/11 did something to the public. It took me a long time to really see it, because at the time I just didn't get how shaken up the world was. So I tried to hide in humor and cynicism. I looked desperately to move on to anything else. The young can do silly things to avoid their problems, and I was no different. But other people had different reactions, which is why it's hard to summarize this event's effects on anything, even comics, without getting into this bigger picture stuff. Because you can't generalize the reaction to this thing. Anyone who tells you that people reacted in one specific way is lying. Some people turned to hatred and wanted shallow revenge. Others just lost hope. I like to think that in the end, most actually opened their hearts a little bit more to the world. The tsunami I mentioned earlier in the Indian Ocean, well, there's another side to that story. That particular disaster actually raised a lot of money from fundraising for relief efforts from all over the world. Like, an unprecedented amount. It seems the widely broadcast suffering of New York City made people a lot more sympathetic to disasters in general, because I remember very well how much everyone tried to raise money in my own community back then after the tsunami. It wasn't long after 9/11, and I think people were really eager to just help other people. Likewise, we saw an awful lot of bravery in the fallout of 9/11 itself. I wonder how many lives were saved by the heroic emergency workers and volunteers who gathered at Ground Zero and gave everything they had just to help out. 9/11 was a terrible thing, but it did not turn us into terrible people. I remember the president at the time, George W. Bush, put in a lot of effort into ensuring that not all Muslims or Arabic people were targets of blame. It would have been really easy to stoke the flames of racism back then, but he and his administration didn't. They worked hard to make it clear there's a big difference between mainstream Islam and whatever these people are. I may not even agree with that or most things President Bush said or did, but I will always respect him for doing this. I saw similar messages of hope, tolerance, and peace broadcast from both sides of the political bench. Yes, mistakes were made. The public was deliberately misled by a complicit media. Politicians did and are getting away with a lot. Especially in one country that seems to be in desperate need of political reform. Yes, I'm talking about you, Japan! Tragedy seemed to flow in the wake of this attack just as much as all other moments of hope and optimism. It's simply not an event that's easily summarized, talked about, or quantified, which is why I spent so much time talking about things without ever really getting to the comics. We'll get to that, but it's important to put these things in perspective. This is especially necessary because somehow I find I am getting old. It's hard to believe that 9/11 happened 15 years ago. I've hit the point where I've lived history as some of our viewers were born long after. And like I have been taught so much of history, it's up to people like me to further teach and explain the significance of events we've lived through, which shape and mold our lives even today. It's important for you younger viewers that were born around or after 9/11 to understand the meaning and relevance of this event because it affects you. It has to affect you. Plus, it might give you a bit of understanding of why everyone seemed to go a little crazy because of it. People were quite literally traumatized, and it was the job of the media at large to find a way for people to cope with this. The news was a big part of this, although they might have dragged that process out by showing 9/11's wreckage over and over again. But entertainment had a different role. They were to provide an escape from it all, however temporary. And while plenty of movies and television also served as examples of this, today we're focusing on how the comic book world responded to it. The first thing I want to highlight is the common mistake of confusing ongoing trends mixed up with an actual response to the attack. Yes, comics in general did get a little bit more topical, darker, and more relevant to the modern world, but in a lot of ways they were long heading in that direction ever since the Silver Age of comics about 30 years before 9/11. It's important to remember that dark comics that dealt with themes of terrorism, war, or personal freedoms were nothing new to the comic book world, and they had been doing this for a long time. But certain topics and themes did become more relevant, just like in television. Terrorism, torture, and the idea of up until now the frequently ignored Arab world started cropping up more and more in comics, both inside and out of Marvel and DC. That's pretty much true of all media during this time, but also just a regular fact of life. Artists, writers, and the creative class in general is always pulling ideas from the contemporary world in order to better reach out to the public. That being said, plenty of other titles went in the exact opposite direction. Like I said, fiction can be a great escape for the public, especially during tough times. Both Marvel and DC produced a lot of content just featuring heroes being heroes. Old stories were retold in new ways. Bright, diverse, and funny stuff was made, with plenty of examples serving as the best the last decade had to offer. The Batman-Superman run at the time, Ultimate Spider-Man, Runaways, and the Young Avengers all come to mind as good examples of this. None of which has a lot to do with 9/11, but that's kind of the point. They were deliberately not about 9/11. They were an escape from all that. They were happy and hopeful. They were fun reads that didn't try to be anything they weren't, and were remarkably effective because of that. It's for these very same reasons I think the original Spider-Man trilogy was such a hit. Its astounding success paved the way for the modern avalanche of superhero movies more than any other film, and in my opinion, it's easy to see why. I'm sure a lot of people roll their eyes nowadays when Spider-Man leaps in front of that flag during the first movie's climax, and the second, and the third. But man, in that first movie, way back in 2002, I remember sitting in a theater full of people, and I remember that moment. And I remember a cheer that erupted into the crowd that I have never seen before, and since. Keep in mind I'm Canadian too. That was a theater full of Canadian people cheering on the American flag. Why? Because America, we're your brothers. We saw you wounded and we were just as hurt by it. We bled with you. We were just as lost with you back then, and movies like Spider-Man helped us deal with it as much as it helped you. You could feel the mood of the crowd and the sentiment going on in everyone's head. Yeah, take that, terrorists! Spider-Man is here! Go America! It was a profound moment. Naked in its obvious patriotism and pandering, but who cares? It came at a time when that sort of thing was sorely, desperately needed. And the crowd's overwhelming reaction in that full theater all those years ago is a perfect expression of the cathartic relief superhero stories could cause. And with that movie, everything changed. Comic book movies, which flamed out in the mid to late 90s, felt a massive resurgence in popularity that has pretty much kept going to this very day. Marvel, in general, seemed particularly apt for dealing with 9/11, mostly because it had to. Let's not forget that by and large its entire super community is centered on New York City. There was no way of avoiding it one way or another. So how did they deal with it? Well, those of you in the know had to see this comic coming in this video. Here we have Marvel's 9/11 Memorial comic. It's pretty grim, but important to remember that came out in that early period after the attacks. Things were pretty bad back then. As I've alluded to, there was real trauma and pain in the air. People were broken and different. They needed to feel again because they were going numb. They were shaken to their core, so they tended to opt for the sad and heartfelt over the logical and making sense, especially in that earlier period. But that's why the opening to this comic is so particularly harsh that it just seems like a blunt bat to the head. But it wasn't that big a deal back then. This sort of imagery was on every channel at all times. Seeing it was nothing new, but people had to deal with these things. And Marvel basically had to reconcile this very real thing happening in their very fictional version of the city where this horrific attack took place. The rest of the comic is not that remarkable. There's a lot of lofty talk and grim, despairing remarks about the loss of life. But it's moving, it's sentimental, it's not bad. But then we get to Doctor Doom, who shows up and just ruins everything. Different time. But it is weird to see Doom cry. We have to remember this was very early after 9/11, and like I said, logic wasn't really winning out in this situation. So it's hard to trash this comic, but that's so stupid. Aside from the fact that it is incredibly out of character, Doctor Doom is a villain, and if we're being real, probably wouldn't have any issue with doing something like this. I mean, no, he wouldn't ram a plane into a building, that's not his style. People have to know it was Doom. But I'm pretty sure Doom would wipe out an entire country if it served his purpose. So him crying over something like this just feels wrong. Especially when there are characters that could have done this just fine, like this one standing right beside him, or this one, or maybe even this one. I don't know, like I said, it's hard to judge. Meanwhile, DC put out something similar, actually working with Dark Horse to do so, but it was just sort of this non-canon charity thing, like what Marvel did, but without really using its continuity or characters or anything like that. It's actually pretty touching and thoughtful, which is kind of boring, so we'll just leave it alone. But good for them. All those early comics were actually a very nice way to raise money for relief efforts, so even with the whole Doctor Doom crying thing, it was all done with the best intentions. I personally just prefer to scrap the whole thing as non-canon and move on. But that didn't change the fact that Marvel as a whole seemed to respond to the event and grapple with it more than any other comic book company. And like I said, it was kinda hard of them not to, what with their universe being so heavily tied to New York. It would have been insulting, or at the very least, really boring to just not acknowledge the situation. As a result, I think the effects of 9/11, and more importantly the themes, ideas, and politics of the event, really bled into Marvel for a long time. It isn't hard to see the political allusions in stories like Civil War, Dark Reign, or Siege. It's pretty clear the ideas being explored here, both from left and right-wing writers, and by and large, a lot of this stuff still has value. I've defended Civil War in the past, but Dark Reign also has some great moments, and Siege is just fun. On the other hand, stuff that kind of went into full disaster mode didn't seem to leave as much of an impression on people, or at least not with me. Secret Invasion comes to mind, but so does Fear itself and a handful of other disaster-heavy titles, which seems reminiscent of the backlash Man of Steel got. So it's, like I said, a very complicated relationship. People didn't seem to mind the darker themes and politics, but they really didn't want to deal with the disaster porn anymore, because that just was no longer fun to us. DC, on the other hand, had a very different relationship with 9/11. As far as I can tell, by and large, that event is not canon in their world. Now in their case, that makes a lot of sense to me. Not only are they largely based around fictional cities, unlike Marvel who generally prefer more real-world locations, but DC heroes are a lot more capable of, say, stopping a plane in mid-air, like Superman has done many times in the past. So kind of wisely, they kept 9/11 out of their history. As a result, the comics seemed a lot more resistant to the political baggage. The way I see it, DC largely went along the same trends they were already heading, without a major shift one way or another. All said, that probably was the right thing for their company at the time. It made sense given the more iconic status of DC to compare it to Marvel, and it works for their universe a bit better. And there's something proud of it, like we are DC, we are an icon, we will not change in the face of terror. But then Jeff Johns came along with a Green Lantern comic that was going to introduce a new Lantern from Earth, an Arabic man named Simon Baz. That's cool, I thought. There aren't many Islamic superheroes, so that's kinda good, and Green Lantern is sort of perfect for this. It's already built in that multiple lanterns can exist, even from Earth, so there's no need to bend or break the rules much when it comes to this stuff. That's how we got a Black Green Lantern, and he's great! So he was all set to premiere in a special comic featuring his origins. and it was wrong for so many reasons. After years of wisely avoiding it, DC just sort of quietly made 9/11 part of their canon, which introduces a whole battery of questions, like where was Superman, or Wonder Woman, or one of the dozens of other heroes more than powerful enough to stop this exact sort of thing. Because come on, we know Batman could have somehow stopped 9/11, because, and say it with me, he's Batman. But on top of all of this, of course, you somehow need to associate this character with 9/11. Because I guess you guys thought you can't have an Arabic character without making 9/11 front and center? It seems a little off, is all I'm saying. It's alright, I'm just picking on DC because they make it easy and fun. They did use it as a kind of jumping off point for the character, who was bullied and picked on because of his status as an Arabic person in the wake of 9/11. Which is okay, although I'm not sure that's super realistic. Regardless, this has a happy ending. Simon himself ended up a really strong character. His insistence on carrying a gun was both kind of smart, given how often lanterns can inconveniently run out of power or lose their abilities, and pretty hilarious. And once Simon, upon his first meeting of Sinestro, shot the villain in the f***ing face, I was pretty sold on the guy. So the story has a good ending, even if DC's relationship with 9/11 makes not a lot of sense. Amusingly, I couldn't find a single direct reference to the attacks anywhere else in recent history, so I have a feeling this is a bit of a continuity fart as it is. Aside from the big two companies, Dark Horse did make the aforementioned publication, and a lot of other independent comics dealt with these ideas and themes on a far more sophisticated level than the superhero stuff usually did. Here's some cool examples. Vertigo published DMZ by Brian Wood. This comes highly recommended, dealing with many themes and ideas based on 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Set in a war-torn New York City during a second American Civil War, it's really well done and worth your time. Another example is Pride of Baghdad by Brian K. Vaughan. Though largely based on the Iraq War, this also felt quite relevant and is very, very good. But we're really only scratching the surface here. This is a really tough video to write about. Not only is it full of emotional baggage, but realistically every comic on some level probably felt the cultural influence of this event. It influenced the art, story choices, and even what was and wasn't published. Because I'm really not interested in making a video 10 days long, I'm going to just go with this quick review and some overly long musings. It's just how I feel about the subject matter. A more thorough look would just involve breaking down individual writers and their reaction to 9/11, which will change from writer to writer. Like I said, I don't like the idea of generalizing the reaction to 9/11. It's complicated and storied. And we all have our own reaction to this event. Honestly, it was just kind of nice to talk about my feelings on the matter, even just for a little bit. I'm sorry if that's not terribly entertaining or what you wanted, but it's worth talking about these things. 15 years after 9/11, the Arab world is in shambles. America is a hot and sexy mess. The world has still got a long way to go, and it will be a long time before we really fully recover or process these events. Seeing that we have already is just not right and not true. Yet we shouldn't despair or look at the world with too much doom or gloom. Globally, being born now means you are less likely to be murdered, more likely to live a longer life, and have more time for leisure and fun than any of our ancestors could have ever dreamed of. Things aren't so bad. We're too good to let one thing, however tragic and violent, stop us or ruin us. I know this because I see the strength in all of us. I see it in my friends and family and the people I meet every day. We're okay. Everything's gonna be okay. And I hope that on some level, some of our younger viewers now will better understand the context of 9/11 and got some ideas about how and why our pop culture was shaped so heavily by it. For my older viewers, I hope this was on some level cathartic. It certainly was for me. And I hope that on some level you can move on, think about it, and gain a little bit of insight concerning a day forever burned into our collective memory. I won't close out with my usual lines about liking and subscribing this video. You do whatever you want. It feels crass to ask for stuff like that in a video like this. Instead, I'm gonna just dedicate this video to all the wonderful people I mentioned throughout it. The relief workers who are and will always be a shining example of the very best humanity has to offer. Those people who put time and money towards helping the hundreds and thousands of victims in the nations surrounding the Indian Ocean. These creators, artists, and performers who helped all of us cope with something tragic and traumatizing. Like I said, wonderful, wonderful people.